Everybody, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Monica, for accepting this up. And I will try to be as brief as I can, so as to maximize the time that we have for our interaction, and also because we have two quite interesting presentations to be made as well. I'm a true believer that this time the path of policy implementation is something that is likely to generate, let's say, a steady growth period ahead. One that will not be as brilliant as it looked like over the first decade of this millennium, of this century, but nonetheless, one that is steadier and more stable, and with a let's say a higher degree of probability of maintenance and sustainability. The economy has been sick of a double malaise, a combination of anemia of productivity with obesity of the public sector. And the two diseases, they feed each other. If we take into account, for instance, sluggish performance of productivity, particularly the so-called total productivity factor, that is to say that productivity that goes beyond the simple increment of capital to labor and so on. The performance of productivity in Brazil has been mediocre, to say the least. Just to give an idea, when one takes off the contribution to growth of incorporation of labor into employment, informal employment, the total factor productivity has moved at a sluggish pace, close to 0.2% per year, in some years recently even negative. So all that exuberant performance that we saw during the first decade of this century was maybe due to simply a shift in levels of formal employment, from a decrease in the levels of unemployment from 11% to 5%, made possible, among other reasons, because of the super cycle of commodity price, low productivity growth, which has to do, of course, with structural factors, the issue of low levels of education of the population. It's true that since the end of the last century, there has been a great improvement in terms of school attendance, school enrollment. When one breaks down the figures for according to different generations, it's amazing how the average schooling of the younger part of the population is way higher than their parents. But of course, the country still has a huge problem with the quality of this education. Not only that, there is the fact that the low levels of investment, of physical capital investment, for many reasons, low savings rates, or the configuration of the income distribution in Brazil that is not necessarily friendly to investments and so on, and the levels of investment to GDP in Brazil have remained for now 3 decades, typically below 20% of GDP. You don't have to go very far to compare those. We don't need to go to Asia. It suffices to compare with some of our Brazilian neighbors, and we'll have an idea of how low have been these investment ratios in Brazil. Particularly, and I go to an important point, investments in infrastructure, which have been below the minimum necessary to keep the existing infrastructure grid, which is, by the way, a precarious one. If it was precarious, it became even more as time passed by. Just to give an idea, the World Bank estimates a minimum of 3% of Brazil's GDP of investments in infrastructure just to keep it where it is. And we have not been able, and Brazil has not been able to invest even at levels above 2.5%. So the fiscal obesity means no space for investments, public investments in infrastructure, which feeds productivity, and also low productivity increase also mean that there is a mismatch between the will to increase public spending and the space that there is there when it comes to GDP. To tackle first the fiscal obesity, a first step, important one, was the spending cap. I like to call the spending cap, the constitutional spending cap, as a straitjacket. You have a sick patient. With due respect, this is no obesity. I hope nobody feels. The way to deal with obesity is to put a straitjacket on the patient, so as to force it not to buy bad food. But of course, the problem with any straitjacket is that it doesn't suffice. You have to have a diet. You have something to make possible that the straitjacket is feasible. And that's where we have the outlay of consecutive reforms. The first one, obviously, the pension reform, given the dynamics. Of course, the pension payments are one of those items that keep rising, no matter who's there in government. It could be PT, it could be PSDB, it could be Temer, it could be PMDB, it could be Bolsonaro. It's a ticking bomb that rises year after year. So the first step has been a substantial pension reform. Will that be enough? No. Particularly because the gains in terms of savings will be accrued only as time passes by. The next step is to curb, to stop, to review the public spending with wages. And that's why you have on the outlay of reforms the administrative reform. Because the World Bank showed this clearly, there is a premium in terms of wages paid to public sector employees in Brazil vis-a-vis the private sector in equivalent functions. That makes Brazil an outstanding case vis-a-vis other emerging markets.
So, as an investor in Brazil, I'm from Brazil, born, raised in Brazil, has invested in Brazil and having clients investing in Brazil. Apparently, I might have a different point of view of what happened now. But maybe because I see things different. I know that all the macroeconomics change. We have seen interest rates going down. The aspects of employment is record high, and we have supplies for every type of segments. But mostly of our clients, we have today about 200 clients, business clients, doing business in Brazil. And out of those, for the last 5 years, only 10% has forfeited Brazil. Which is, to some extent, it's a high probability than the Brazilian companies doing business in Brazil. In the last, naturally Brazilian companies die in the first 5 years about 60 to 75%. Well, you can tell me, those Americans, they have deep pockets. That's true, but they are betting better than the Brazilians. It's very interesting to it. As an investor, about 5 years ago, we opened our first office in Brazil. And from there, another office. From there, today we have over 50 people working in these two offices. It is tough to do business. To do business in Brazil, you have to be here, correct? But there is benefits of doing that.
that we are in a very unique moment to invest in Brazil right now. I don't know if Otaviano agrees 100%, but basically the current level, BRL against dollar is in the lowest historical ever. That combined with the fact that real estate assets depreciated a lot over the last 5 years, especially from 2014 to 2016. If we talk about the real estate, about the residential segment, would say something around 30%, which is a lot. I can tell what happened. And also because when you are looking at other countries' return, they have been reducing, asset return. So I'm very true believer that right now it's a very good moment to invest in Brazil. You have different market time for segments, office, shopping malls, residential, etc. But in a nutshell, I'm bullish on Brazil. Starting from the office space, which I would say is our main bet. It has been our main bet over the last 3 years. What has happened is that right now the vacancy rate is dropping very fast. I'm going to give you an example. Last year we rented our office. The building was 30% vacant. We were paying somewhere around $50 per square foot. And this year is 100% occupied, and the rate increased roughly 30%. So what happens is that the supply was coming to the market by 2016, and since then we are observing very few supply coming to the market. And on the other hand, the demand is picking up.
In 187 countries ranked by the World Bank, Brazil comes on the 185th worst tax-friendly system. So, and the tax reform is not by chance in the party line, one that will probably harmonize, simplify procedures and so on. But what I wanted to highlight is the fact that there is a new component in the environment. Which is the fact that for the first time, yesterday, Caixa Econômica Federal announced giving lending for real estate at the rate of 7.5%, which has never been heard of in Brazil. And this is after Bradesco and Itaú also stepped in. So in terms of credit-based real estate investment in Brazil, now at least there's something that has improved and may help the asset price.
Yeah, Daniel mentioned that the exchange rate is at a historic low, although I'm not so sure that Brazil is inexpensive yet, that exchange rate. Curious, and maybe the answer is that I'm just directed to Canuto, and maybe the answer is, well, it depends on economic policy. What are your opinions long-term about the exchange rate, where it is, where it might be going, maybe relative to inflation, relative to the interest rate? So,
I will give you two scenarios, which are the ones that I have used in my response to clients of people who ask me. It will depend a bit on what happens between US and China. And the reason for that is the following. As we all know, the worse things get, the higher the search for refugee on U.S. treasuries. And this has been the major fact underlying not only the capital outflows from emerging markets, but also the valuation of the appreciation of the dollar, which runs against President Trump's desire to have a decrease in the trade imbalance. It's contradictory, but that's the fact. I have worked with the exchange rate ending close to $4 for a real dollar at the end of this year. if the unfolding of the crisis, let's say, in their double signals, we might have a limited agreement from this week with respect to soybeans and so on, but it's still the deep disagreements on the issue of technology transfer, as we are seeing in the case of the prohibition to Chinese companies and so on. In that case, I would put the range of the upwards of the real to 4.2. But it's something, as I said, I would work with a range of 4 to 4.2, depending the extremes on how things unfold here in terms of risk aversion in the system.
If you want to invest in the real estate market to capture the growth, you can make money in Brazil right now. Invest in the office space, in shopping malls, because prices are very depreciated. But you cannot look at the current yield. You need to look forward. Invest in Brazil. I don't know what would be your expectations, but I believe that should be somewhere above 15% return, right? You can get there. You can get there, but it's going to take more risk. To find an income producing property that generates today 10%, it's in a good price, pretty rare in Brazil.